Thanks for tuning into the Pacey Performance Podcast. This morning, I am delighted to welcome Alan Murdoch and Jonas Dodoo. So welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hey,
Thanks for having us.
Coffee at the ready.
Yeah,
It's
coffee,
7:15.
Yeah, everything ready.
We're gonna just in the just because of time, we're gonna skip on the intros or deep intros. Plus, Jonas has been on here just as much as I have, I think.
Yeah.
Third time lucky. We're all good. So Jonas, coming to you first. Brief intro, and then we'll go to Alan for his little brief intro as well, and then we'll dive into the meat of the conversation.
Let me quit all my other apps. Brief intro from me. I'm Jonas. I'm director of Speedworks and head coach up here in Loughborough. I love coaching. I love coach education. I love speed, and I'm in search of the truth. And so rather than being completely, I'm going to say limited by what I've learned and completely driven by what's come before me, I cherish it, I love it, but I'm trying to search for a way forward, a way that enables people to come to maybe some of my conclusions that I've come up with over the past 15 years, but quicker. And that's why I'm in love with Alan. Yeah, because at the end of the day, I look at him and I learn from him. And what I really learn the most is that he's been able to synthesize what I preach and what I push, and he's summarized it in such a nice way that's enabled a lot more coaches to understand my philosophy a lot quicker. So there you go. I've started my intro by saying I love Alan instead of saying I love my wife. This is going to be a challenging next couple hours when I come off this podcast. But there you go. That's my brief and short intro.
Nice, mate. Thank you, Alan. He's set you up perfectly there. Take it away.
Well, I'm the recipient of the love. So I am head coach at Speedworks Bath, and I just came out of professional rugby at Bath Rugby. And I guess the big summary there was that I went through a journey that most young S&C coaches probably went through, from doing their UKSCA to going through the ranks, through academies, etc., and learning the trade. And then I started to move into the ranks of the senior team and get involved in the rehabilitation side of things at the club. And I started to recognise that there was a big gap in my knowledge from my journey that existed around speed, the end stage of return to play, the role that speed actually has within the rehab process, and my own big philosophy as well. So I reached out to Jonas, got in contact with him while I was still working at the club, and started to recognise that actually my experiences up until that point had really been more gym based and kind of traditional, I guess you would say, for most strength and conditioning coaches that I've spoken to anyway. And it opened my eyes to a new world of physical development and how we can change what we do. And eventually I decided that I was going to go out my own and formed a partnership with Jonas. Now I'm at Bath doing my own thing, and I speak to Jonas most days and we bounce off each other, and my philosophy has drastically changed as a result of that, and it's really been quite eye-opening to work with some incredibly elite athletes, but also some regular athletes as well, and other coaches, and starting to recognise that actually there's a whole other world out there in terms of what speed can offer, and the thought process that can give us in terms of how we apply our trade and make as much change as possible within the short time frame that we're allowed with our athletes. So I guess that would be the summary, and then we'll discuss it again in the next hour.
Nice, mate. What's the transition been like from professional sport to self-employment?
Do you know, I was really, I guess scared was probably the right word, if I'm honest. I had this secure job, and it was at a club that had a lot of prestige, and I really didn't know what was to come. But actually, I've found for me, it's given me this new lease of life to surround myself with the people I want to surround myself with. Go and suck knowledge out of the people I want to do that from, and also really have the license to experiment more, without the shackles of being a part of a bigger establishment or a bigger team. And the results for me they've been unbelievable. Not only from like the physical side of thing for the athletes, but it's also just given me so much freedom as a coach to actually go and explore and see what I can do with things and where I can take it that's different. And it's been awesome. It's been unbelievably exciting, and I've learned so much in the process. So it's been great.
Nice, mate. And someone next to you with plenty of experience in this area as well, navigating this world, Jonas.
Yeah, well, the world of speed or the world of self-employment, which one?
Both.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I'm 2012 was when I stopped working for British Athletics, so I guess it's nearly 10 years. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
Congratulations making it this far.
yeah,
It's no mean feat, is it? Like, not all jokes aside,
Mm.
it can be mayhem at times.
It can be
But
mayhem, and
yeah,
you know, before we were a family, when it was just me, it was relatively easy because I could live on bread and chicken. Really, like that could be my five a day. And yeah, the challenges happen as your family grow, and as and you know you can. I could land a new contract with a new team, and I could be really, really happy and go, yeah, the bank account. And I come home and I'll tell my wife, and she'll be like, yeah, good, well done. And I tell my kids, and they'll be like, okay, but daddy, I've pooed my pants. I'm like, okay. It's like your day carries on as normal. There is nothing that new that changes. So like, whereas before it's like, yay, business, work, definitely big motivator for me. But you come home, and if things aren't sorted at home, it doesn't matter. You could be king of a castle. You could be, you could be full stack. So you could be vowed. You could be your business could be doing great things, right? But if the other side isn't sorted, yeah, it's no fun.
let's have a little chat around this amalgamation of the rehab world and speed. Where is that at, and where are the gaps that you guys potentially see that you can fit in a very global sense? I'll come to you first, Jonas, then we'll dive back to Alan.
I think that if you talk to the great physios, the great physical conditioning coaches, and in fact, if you go to individual sports, if you look at the great technical coaches who develop great tennis players or great track and field athletes, they don't really see the difference between rehab and performance. And Jordan Mendegucci's big one that he keeps saying is that prevention is not an exercise. It's not a Nordic. It's not a Copenhagen. Prevention is a philosophy, right? Prevention is how you understand your sport, how you understand your coaches, and how you understand the athletes you have, and how you take those three maybe core components and recognize what you need to do to gradually build to your worst case scenario training. And that really is what prevention is: understanding your sport at its worst case and reverse engineering from that, and giving the athlete the building blocks so they can deal with that, be it from off season, pre-season, into your the heart of I don't know, Christmas for football is probably the worst period, or maybe approaching some of the worst period for rugby as well. So I think that how you see performance and you see the underpinning qualities of performance, if you see it the way, at least I think we're now starting to see it, you don't really separate rehab and physical preparation. You see it as one, and you take the individual in front of you in the state that they come to you in, and you figure out what they need right now to get them from here to there. And so it's a bit general, a bit fluffy, but it's looking at it that way has really helped me go, okay, that's why when I've had to rehab a grade 3C hamstring injury, I've walked away and the player has come back faster. So not just come back quickly, but when they've returned, they've run faster. They've been more confident in their ability to step on the gas or to decelerate and re-accelerate in a different direction. And it's made me wonder. And the same things happen with all my hamstring rehabbers in track and field. They've returned faster. So then I ask myself, is my training intervention for rehab not just my performance intervention? Through the rehab process, have I not just learned better how to load specific tissues in a way that is going to transfer better to performance? And have I not just found a better, I guess, proportion of how to train. And actually in the past, was I just doing what maybe I was taught to do, or what the constraints of that team has restricted me to do, not necessarily the best thing for the athlete and for performance.
Just coming to you, Alan. Why should speed be at the forefront of people's mind when, excuse me, when starting the rehab process? Not just thinking of it as the final bit that gets tagged on the end to kind of give them the tap on the back to go return to full training.
Yeah, it's almost like flipping it on its head. I think when it's at the top of the pyramid, it acts as your reference point, your framework for decision making. So historically in traditional models, everything's been very segmental. It's like we'll go into the gym and we're going to get this one body part and we're going to get it really, really strong. And by the time it's strong, then we're going to go out onto the pitch and then we're going to start thinking about running. And there is a time and a place for that. There's a time and a place to develop the physical qualities, I think, of the muscle in isolation, because if it has a weakness, then certainly the body's going to reroute around that weakness. But I think when speed sits at the top of the pyramid and it influences your decision making, I think all of a sudden you can start to ask questions of your process, starting to say from day one, if this doesn't have an influence on their ability to run fast, be agile, decelerate, change direction, repeat that, be efficient, and ultimately be more fit for purpose, then it doesn't have a place in the entire thing. It doesn't have a place in the process. And I think it really needs a good, solid understanding of what speed is and some bigger philosophical points around speed and what those are. So to me, those are like your big forces, your short time frames, your right directions, and arguably the most important one for me that we miss out on so often is done the right way. So when we talk about big forces, to me that's it's really about the contractile element. How much force am I producing isometrically, eccentrically, concentrically? In the right time frame is more rate of force development. Can I produce those big forces and start to decrease the time frame by which I'm applying those forces? And I think most coaches and S&Cs will recognise that it's the player who can apply big forces in increasingly shorter time frames. Can they beat their opponent to the mark that's actually going to be the performance, kind of the big performance key milestone in terms of looking at players' ability. The right direction is, for me at least, makes it very simple in terms of my planning around what we're doing. Is it horizontally based or is it vertically based? And I can start to split that up into acceleration and decel and change of direction type stuff versus max velocity and more vertical based. And that makes my planning of my week of my stimulus, that makes it quite simplistic for me in terms of laying out a week and choosing what stimulus I want to put in. And then done the right way, and this is the big one for me, and this is probably the one I've learned from Jonas the most, is Jonas talks about bum before back. And initially, and I'm sure people have listened to the podcast before and heard this phrase, and when I first heard this phrase, I was nodding and I was like, what is he talking about? Anyway, so once I started to become more familiar with speed and coaching speed and seeing the shapes and the patterns that speed needs, especially with really good athletes, you start to recognize that they are able to use their backsides more, their bums, their hips. They're able to generate forces with that area of their body and transmit that force down into the floor. And I guess it's the same with a thrower as well. If you can generate force proximally, closer to the pelvis and closer to the trunk, and transmit that into a ball or a bat or a racket or whatever, you get this lovely sequential acceleration like a whip. And when we're in the gym, what we see is people doing the right stuff, right? We see people doing various exercises targeted at trying to elicit a certain adaptation that's targeting the injury. But what we see a lot of the time is somebody loading up a glute bridge or maybe a hand clean or whatever it might be. And you see them lifting loads of weight, and we celebrate that. Strength and conditioning coaches, I think we have a habit of celebrating load. Like we're like, 200 kg glute bridge, what a legend. This rehab's going really well. But what we don't tend to look at, well, how is he lifting that weight with that 200 kilograms on his hip? Is he using his hip to drive that weight and be really proximal to distal without flaring his ribs open or using his erectors to drive that hip extension? Is his chin way back, or is it on his chest with a nice quiet spine to complement that hip drive and that proximal to distal? In a power clean, and this is a big one for ACL that I see, and I learned this at the Santry Clinic in Dublin with Enda King, and looking at people who do power cleans and variations of jumps, and when they catch that weight and that landing mechanism, are they all quad based, or can they dissipate that force through their hip? Can they balance the load distribution through knee and through hip, or do they all go onto the fronts of their knees? And there's little cues that exist in the gym, I think, and in drills and various things that start to tell you whether somebody or not is actually that bum before back strategy, that really efficient strategy, or whether or not they're the opposite, whether they might be effective in terms of going from A to B, but very definitely not efficient. And I think rehab provides us this lovely opportunity, and Jonas alluded to it there, that rehab is just good training, right? It's basically the one opportunity that we get as coaches to have a long period of time to do things the right way without any interruptions of games and fatigue and extra load, etc. That actually we can start to coach people to be more efficient, and it's the more efficient guys are the ones that can, certainly that I see, the ones in game that can repeat their efforts. Instead of doing one effort that takes it all out of their tank, they can start to repeat it. They can be athletes who last for the game, who have performance moments at the last minutes of the game, who aren't absolutely dead after 10 minutes because they've exerted all their energy being effective for 10 minutes, not 80 or 90. And that to me is what good rehab is, and that to me is what having a speed-based approach around different principles like that start to influence how we do a really good job in what may be a 6-week, 6-month, 9-month process, depending on the injury.
Just staying with you, Alan, come to you in a minute, Jonas. Is it the fact that you've been a speed coach and had that speed emphasis and then taken that mindset into the gym that you're thinking about the things that you're talking about there versus the opposite, versus someone that's very gym-based, very gym-dominant, and then trying to translate that onto the pitch in terms of speed, maybe has that gap there is the bit that you guys can potentially plug as speed coaches doing it in the reverse?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it just comes down to looking at movement. I think if you're immersed in watching complex movement, not complicated, but complex movement, lots of things happening that interact with each other, like speed, like agility, braking, all that stuff. I think that's the end outcome. The reason we go into the gym is to enhance those abilities. So if you start at the top end, if you start looking at movement and starting to see, well, these strategies and these sequencing of muscle activation are the ones that the guys who are efficient and effective at what they're doing on the pitch showcase, then we can reverse engineer that back into the gym. I think if you start in the gym and you're all about squat pattern, deadlift pattern, your press, your pull, I think there's huge value in that for sure, but it makes it very difficult to then take that and then link it to what is something that's far more complex out on the pitch. So I think to do a good job, you've got to reverse it back from what is probably the most complex and the most demanding situation for your eye. And I think certainly for me 2 years ago, I was the opposite, going out and coaching speed and coaching movement and having intricate conversations about something as simple as shin roll and pinning your shin and understanding what that means to push your bum forwards and accelerate well. I would have been like, whoa, no, let's go back to the gym, please. Because that's where I was comfortable. But having done the speed coaching, having failed numerous times and done terrible jobs occasionally with certain people, to then get better and better and better, I think that has allowed me to go back into the gym, and what allows Speedworks to be able to go back into the gym and start to see different movement patterns and coach intersegmental coordination that influences performance more than the other way around.
Jonas, Alan mentioned the bum before back. Anyone that is not demonstrating what you want to see there, what are the first places that you would go to alter that and make that look as how you want it to look?
Well, firstly, what am I looking for? And I think before people think it's some really, like Alan said, complicated thing, it's not. It's just an understanding of what a good hinge pattern really should look like. Yeah. So if we just take ourselves to a simple straight leg deadlift, an RDL, right? Um, and we have to ask ourselves, when the person is bending over in the RDL, is there like a balance between their bum going backwards and their trunk coming forwards, or actually is their hip staying where it is, and they're just bending forwards at the trunk, right? Or are they sitting back a bit? And I remember reading, or it was something Franz Boschi maybe a long time ago, and in introduction to one of his exercises was just to stand with a wall behind you, maybe a couple inches with your bum away from the wall, and to do your deadlift pattern. And your first initiation, the first feeling you need to start to feel is both your shoulders forward, going forward, but also your bum touching the wall. You're feeling that hinge at your hip. And so that's almost my feeling of how you create the space and create deflection. And then most importantly, how do we stand up out of it? Do we stand up with the initiation of our head and our shoulders and our diaphragm lifting so that our erectors can be the driver, so our lats can be the driver? Or actually, is our spine quiet, like Alan said? And actually our bum pushing forwards, force going through the ground, bracing through our hinging through our hamstrings and then our glutes to support that push, and then the spine comes secondary to it. So that is really the simplest way to look at it. You might see the same thing in a hip bridge, in a hip hinge. Some kind of hip bridge, single leg, double leg, whatever it is, where actually again your diaphragm, your trunk is not the first and major movement that occurs. Really, it occurs because you push through the ground, through your feet, and that initiates your hips to rise. And maybe there's a bit of a posterior tilt as they rise. And okay, you might get some lordosis, you might get some spine movement. That's not the issue. The spine is meant to move. The question is, what's the driver? So I don't know if I'll answer your question, but I wanted to be clear there for the listeners and the viewers that bum before back is not some special thing that you need a scope on your eye to be able to see. It really is just really efficient movement that means the right muscles are doing the right jobs. Yeah, they're not sharing. They're not doing the wrong jobs. The erectors are there to keep your spine erect for sure, but biggest muscle in your body is your bum, and we know that should be the driver.
So taking that RDL as an example, Jonas, and then the transfer to what you would see on the pitch, on the track, why is all them things, them intricate things that you've just talked about, why is that so important? And what, if getting that wrong, how does that transfer to things that you don't want to see on the grass of the track?
Fine. I think bum before back is important because Alan mentioned sequential acceleration. Yeah. So this proximal to distal pattern, and what we see, like there's enough literature to give us the proof and the clarity that that's the most explosive way to work. Or the most efficient way to be explosive, let's say. And so when you take that to the pitch, what do you see? You see, again, if your biggest muscle in your body should be a bum. For some people, it's their quads, yeah. But it should be a bum, and we know that okay, your bum and your posterior chain are massive drivers for speed and for power. We also know even if your quad seems to be the driver, that if your posterior chain is not involved with good co-contractions, that actually will now increase in the likelihood of injuries, specifically ACLs. And so, and actually, I think when you look at most of the injury patterns, a lot of them come back to, is there good co-contractions happening from the posterior chain with the anterior chain? Is the groin and the long groin muscles working with the hamstrings and working with the quad to secure the knee or secure the ankle, secure the hip? So we're constantly coming back to this need for the hamstrings, for the glutes, to be organized with the other muscle groups, even if they're not the main drivers of that movement. So even in deceleration, for example, where, of course, the knee and the quad is going to be very heavily, and so is the ankle and the hip, right? But if the posterior chain is not involved, then we know that there's more likelihood of injury. But something as simple as just the direction of your force. If I'm accelerating and I want to go forwards, I really want to use my bum as the major driver. Now, you can look into the research and look into the EMG, and the quad in early acceleration is heavily involved. It makes sense. But what we also see is that if you can't reduce your ground contact times every step as you're starting to accelerate and transition, increase your step time, increase your hip height, then you actually stagnate in your acceleration. You have a decent early acceleration and it quickly decays, right? So where there is a second stage to your acceleration. Your first stage, I'm going to say, is your first 3 to 4 steps. But what about your next 5 to 6 steps? What are you doing? Well, the actions that you need to be able to do there require that you transition your hips. And we don't want players to keep thinking about too many technical things. We kind of want them to have a pattern in early acceleration that is very similar or maybe identical to the pattern happening in mid, late, and max velocity. So there are some complex interactions happening in this transition, and the simplest solution is to start with your bum before back. If you start by throwing your shoulders forwards, having your bum involved in that, having your spine quiet so that your your pelvis stays stable, and pin your shin, like Alan says, attacking the ground with a stiff ankle and a stiff shin enables you then to keep using your bum as the major driver. If you don't, so if you end up landing maybe out in front of your center of mass, really rolling your shin or using your shin roll across the run as your major contribution to propulsion, then what you end up finding is that the knee becomes the dominant movement pattern. The knee becomes the dominant part of acceleration across the whole run. So your hips don't transition organically. So I talk about organic transition really being if you initiate your run with your shoulders going forwards, your bum being the driver, and your ankle and shin being relatively stiff, you will naturally transition your hips every step because your shin always lands in a place where you can push forwards and up at the same time. But if you end up landing out in front, you don't end up switching your limbs effectively. You end up blocking, then you set up this pattern of blocking first, rolling the knee, maybe even dropping your center of mass, and then pushing again. You set up a pattern where you have to stay on the ground in order to be propulsive as well as to not fall over. And so if you start that way, you're going to end that way. And that's probably really the biggest summary. If we want players to naturally get to good velocities, if we want them, so forget max velocity. If we're talking about rugby, people say, oh, we never run at max velocity. So let's say we want them to accelerate really hard for really long. Yeah. Some people say, yeah, but I want them to get to max V even quicker. That's the aim. They're going to hit someone in 15 meters. So if you want them to accelerate really hard, really fast, then we're still saying all the same things. There is a second stage to acceleration that isn't your first 3 to 4 steps. And if we want that to happen organically, there is a movement pattern that we have to condition. There is a type of stability around the pelvis and a reflexive pattern that we have to condition. And that is deterred and is basically destroyed if the quad, especially the lateral quad, but I'm just going to say the quad, the knee is the main propulsive mechanism or part of your body, and your bum and your hamstrings are quiet, are shy, and are left in the back seat.
Alan, coming to you next. Thanks, Jonas.
No
Starting early in the rehab process with speed in mind, can you give us some examples of how people may translate that into something visual and how you may do that in an example that you've got?
I think it starts with an understanding of like some of those big key tenets of speed. So not just the big four, like big forces, short time frames, etc. is very vague. It's very big. I think we need to dive down a little bit deeper and go and investigate some of the work from maybe Ken Clark and Peter Whalen, people like that, and start to understand, okay, these are some of the technical, physiological things that influence speed. And then we can break that down even further, and then I can try and answer that question, Rob. And to me, really, all the summary of that work is basically, can somebody prepare early for ground contact? Can they whack the ground really hard? And can they then spike their ground reaction forces and get off the ground? And have this elastic response on the floor to try and spike up that ground reaction force and then move into the next cycle as they recover their leg. That, to me, basically is a very neat summary of being able to run fast. And if we go into that a little bit deeper, we talk about having a stiff stance leg is one of the things that Ken Clark talks about, and having this stiffness, this system stiffness, so that you don't yield on ground contact, you don't leak your forces, you apply them into the force and into the ground. And if you've done what Jonas has said there and you've used this bum before back strategy, you've earned the right to then, as you transition, start to hit the ground really hard with a stiff stance leg and not leak any of that force. One of the other things is being able to switch your thighs, and they refer to that as thigh angular velocity, but basically, can I, with speed, alternate my thighs back and forward? Can I dissociate my pelvis? So that's one of the other key physical qualities, the key physical abilities to be able to run fast. And then we've got this attacking from above type situation where we create time to create force with the thigh out in front of the body, in high degrees of flexion, where the other leg is the stance legs and extension. And that gives us an opportunity to then really increase our foot velocity down into the floor to again spike those ground reaction forces. So those kind of tenets then start me to be able to think, okay, well, if I know those things are the things that influence speed, and we're having this performance-based approach where we're going to try and incorporate the things we need to do to increase speed early, I'm really going to go into that stuff with a couple of streams of movement. And those streams of movement are going to be, the first one is going to be the hip lock stream. So it's very Franz Bosche, but ultimately we're talking about, everybody always gives it a wry smile when you mention Franz Bosch, don't they? Everybody always has a smile. So basically what we're talking about there is, can I extend one leg and one hip into the floor while the other leg is flexed? While we have tension through our shin and through our foot in this position of almost like a right angle at the pelvis. And what that's doing is it's allowing us to explore that lateral hip strength, that glute strength, that hamstring strength of being able to extend that stance leg. It's developing stiffness qualities and coordination around the pelvis. And when we go back to those things that I talked about, being stiff stance leg and attacking from above being one of them, one of the key tenets to increase your speed, then we can start that stuff almost straight away. As long as you can extend your knee and extend your hip, you can drop into some hip lock work straight away. And you can start to strengthen up that lateral hip and be able to explore the patterns that are certainly helpful and have an impact on some of that stiffness around the leg. So that would be one of the first ones that I do. And for people, the listeners who are trying to imagine what that looks like, if you're standing and balancing on one leg, straighten out your leg and squeeze your butt. And then on the other leg, flex the hip at 90 degrees, point your toes up and keep your shin underneath your hamstring. Certainly not out in front, but underneath your hamstring. And then if you extend into the floor with that hip, you'll start to feel a burning sensation up the outside of the stance leg. But you should also start to feel the hip flexor on the psoas working on the alternate side, the free leg side. And once we can achieve that and we can build capacity there, and that can be done, I've started doing that stuff like 6 days post-surgery, 5 days post-surgery, really, really early. Then we can start to incorporate a lot of stuff around spinal mechanics. And I was introduced by Jonas to this concept of the spinal engine, which basically is some work done by, I think his name is Serge Gratovetsky. I think somebody's probably going to message you and say I've murdered that name, but I think that's what it is. And he talks about the lateral rotation and flexion of the spine contributing to increasing forces through the pelvis. And they looked at, I think it was Russia, and they looked at paraplegic populations and tried to understand, well, how do people with no legs still manage to locomote? And what they found was they started to study the spine, and they started to find that actually the rotation that we see at the spine, the flexion and rotation that we see at the spine, actually is a big key driver to what happens at the pelvis, and dissociating the pelvis between flexion and extension and being able to drive forces into the floor and ultimately locomote. So once we introduce our hip lock stuff, then we can start to introduce movement around the spine and reaches and flexions, and we can start to turn that into dynamic movements, etc. And I think these things start to, induce coordination adaptations, start to induce neural adaptations around coordination to drive extra force and help people understand how they manipulate their body to try and create force and locomote efficiently. The second thing, and this is maybe the biggest thing in rehab, is that people really, once there's an explanation and a rationale, people really buy into it. They start to recognize, oh, well, I'm not in the gym at day 8 and I've just come out of surgery and, oh my God, I'm now starting to talk about strengthening my quad. Like, it's the last thing I want to do. I'm sore, I'm disengaged, I'm injured. This is rubbish. But actually, when you can link it to all of this stuff starts to drive performance and speed and efficiency on the pitch, it completely changes the game. People end up looking forward to their motor control sessions. They look forward to the stuff that in traditional rehabs actually wouldn't have happened until maybe month 6, but they're doing it at day 6. All of a sudden, there's a bigger buy-in to that process. So that's the first one, the hip lock stream, and that's kind of linked towards that bum before back, that projection that we always talk about, being able to extend your hip. The next stream would be the reflex stream. So that to me is what Jonas calls reactivity, but basically your ability to get off the floor. How elastic can you be? And that to me starts with things as basic as foot intrinsics. I don't think we potentially recognize the value of the ankle and the foot as much as maybe we do. And I think we spend a lot of time in the gym and rehab developing this, maybe for the right reasons as well, right? Maybe somebody appreciates bum before back and they're right, we're going to develop cross-sectional area and force-producing capabilities and motor control strategies around the glutes and the pelvis. And you do all that, but unless you develop the tissues and the elasticity around the foot and the ankle, I don't think that this newfound force and coordination ability is going to be as worthwhile as it possibly could have been, maybe even detrimental, unless we strengthen the end of the whip. We talk about whipping from the hip, right? And that bum before back is giving us this perfect whip from the hip. But unless the tip of the whip is reinforced, the tip of the whip's going to come off pretty quickly because all this force is going through it. So when I think about the reflex side of things, it starts to me with really basic foot intrinsics. It moves to very gradual ankling and capacity work around tib-ant, tim-post, the perineals, the feet themselves, and then it gradually starts to move through towards more reactive from band-assisted to unband-assisted to all your plyometric progressions that move throughout. But to me, there's no excuse or no reason why we shouldn't be training the foot and the ankle very, very quickly. And that's the second stream. And then the third stream would be the pre-tension, would be the switch, the ability to interchange our limbs quickly. And what that does, the ability to switch one leg from flexion to extension and vice versa between across the pelvis, is that really starts to help athletes understand how to create pre-tension and preparation through the pelvis prior to ground strike. Now, that might start off with very, very basic walking modalities, where you understand how to flex one hip and extend the other hip and switch across those two things. And gradually the intensity of that increases through velocity, gradually it increases through complexity of the drill that you're asking people to do. And by doing those three things, I think we address those qualities that I talked about that stiff stance leg, about scissoring the thighs quickly, about having that negative foot speed or that fast foot speed down into the ground to spike those ground reaction forces. By starting those 3 streams early, hip lock, reflex and switch, I think we prepare for running without actually running, because all of those things initially will be done in place before they start to move across the floor. And I think that's key for people to understand, is that you can do so much more than you think you can maybe do with injured athletes early on in the process, as long as it's targeted to the demands of running fast and running efficiently. And what I've found is that people buy into it. The return to, one of the biggest things as well, I think, is that it permits you to, when you do return to running, when you do get back on your feet, you're so much more able to tolerate the demands of that running. And we employ a bit of a fast to slow approach, which means the modalities that we do will be faster compared to slower, ploddy type conditioning when we return to feet. All of a sudden, we've built up the qualities necessary, the coordinations necessary to actually reap benefit out of those that type of approach, instead of spend 3 weeks trying to acclimatise to it. So that's really, when I say starting speed early in the rehab cycle, that's what I'm doing. In terms of what that looks like, exercises that probably take me a day or two to go through them all. But yeah, that's the philosophy, that's the approach, and what we found is that it engages players much more, and physically and from a coordination point of view, we can start to make use of the forces that we've spent so long generating in the gym. We can actually make use of them, and this phrase, if force is king, coordination's the crown, that comes to mind. Like, we spend so much time really generating these big forces, but without going through those streams, we don't really have the right to utilize them as well as we should. And if we don't do it early, then we're just going to have to catch up time later down the line. So to me, it's time wasted. So
you said he was good, Jonas. Alan, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Jonas. Have you got kids in the background?
No, they were getting in the car, so they're gone now.
Oh, no worries. Alan, just coming back to you very quickly, but I'll get Jonas involved in this as well. A big push on the foot and ankle in terms of training it, isolating it through JB, through Joel Smith, various other people. With that comes the skeptics that there's too much emphasis on it. It's doing this, it's doing that. In terms of isolating whether it be a rehab process or not, training that area, any examples that you can give people to just get a picture in people's mind of how they may go about that?
Yeah, 100%. So a lot of barefoot activity. So when we're doing our drills to warm up, for example, I'm a big fan of using prep as a prep for performance for the exact thing that we're going to do. It's not just a general prep. So if we're going into a max speed session, say, what I'll do is definitely get people shoes off. Let's get into our socks. Let's go through some drills. Let's go through our A walks, A marches, our wall drives, or whatever it might be. Let's do it barefoot, and let's think about the tripod foot. Let's think about where our foot pressure is. Let's think about keeping tension through our foot. The other side of things, if this is more rehab setting, say we want to go shin and calf and foot combined. We want to try and hit it all at once. And we want to hit lateral hip as well. So we've got a decline board set at an angle. You're standing single-legged on that decline board, so your foot is on a slant. You've maybe pulled a band into a pal-off position, and you're extending your hip, and you're working really, really hard through the outside of your shin to try and create tension and stability through that foot. I think when we start to put bands on people and do foot intrinsics and spend 10 minutes doing our extension flexions, all that stuff, I think people disengage. I think what we need to do is find opportunities to tie in foot and ankle, which is really easy. Barefoot's the way that I do it mostly, and another nice way to do it would be the pre-tension around the foot and the ankle. So multi-surface jumps. So I'm thinking about this because I did it yesterday. So we have maybe 5 obstacles. Tackle shield for rugby, if you're familiar with what that is. a couple of boxes, a yoga mat, and a weight plate. And all you're asking people to do is just rebound over and off the different surfaces, the different objects. And what that forces the body to do, what it forces the foot and ankle to do, is prepare early for a surface that it doesn't know what it's going to give it back. It doesn't know whether it's going to be sand and dissipate all the force. It doesn't know whether it's going to be a hard track-like object where the force is going to generate and you're going to pop off that ground. So to avoid this huge disparity in landing and taking off, your body has to prepare, and it prepares through the foot. Has to prepare early through the foot. And that variable surface training is, one, it's engaging. Two, it feels like something an athlete would do. And three, it starts to train the foot, the ankle, the calf complex to start to create those pre-tension abilities, that early preparation to get ready for ground strike. Because that's all we're doing it for, right? Is to really create an opportunity for that foot to transmit force into the floor, not leak into the floor. So that's the type of stuff that I do. And the more fun, the better. Because foot and ankle training, like it's not fun. Like it's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, but it's very, very necessary, and it can certainly be tied into other things which make it feel like, do you know what, actually, I am training speed here, and my foot and my ankle are mad important in this process, because a lot of the stuff that we'll talk about to athletes, Jonas and myself included, will be prepare for the floor. Don't let the floor meet you. Don't let the floor engulf you. You hit the floor. You whack the floor. You take command. And the foot is crucial to that.
Have you got any thoughts on that, Jonas?
Yeah, I've got notes here. I'm writing notes on as he speaks. I look, the last thing I wrote was this fun and the psychology of speed, and the fact that you will have players that you need to engage with, and you need to remain engaged through maybe a long-term rehab. You'll have managers and coaches and other players who are not injured who you'll need to engage, because potentially you now see an opportunity to input on their ability to perform. And so the psychology of speed really becomes the biggest factor. When we talk on periodization or skill development or whatever it is, there is so much discussion on everything away from what the athlete really wants, or what is going to create buy-in and what's going to keep them engaged and driving, not just surviving through your session, but thriving and asking questions and learning. And those are the best environments we all want to be in. And so I definitely look at exercise selection. I look at all of this stuff we're talking on now and recognize that if you sit down, or if you lie down and do a glute clam, and you sit down and pull a towel in with your feet, it's something you can only really do for a few weeks in a rehab period before either the athlete completely disengages, they carry on, but there is no real mind-muscle connection, or they bin it off completely. So when we think of exercise adherence, and when we think about getting the athlete to drive the process, it's far easier and simpler, at least for me, to get them to stand up, like Alan says, single leg. So let's say we're trying to activate the feet and we're trying to create some proprioception and some connection between the hip and the foot. You're far better off just standing up single leg and teaching them the feeling of when their free hip drops, how much it creates, how much effort it requires to be stable on their stance leg, versus when their free hip stays level or above. Oh, how much simpler, how much less shaky that is. When their free hip stays above and actually they push through the ground, how stable and strong they feel when you start to perturb them, as opposed to when they allow everything to drop, free hip to drop, overpronate, the inside of their ankle is touching the floor, and then now actually they're struggling just to support their own body weight, let alone you pushing on them. Why is that important? Because then you can turn around and say, this is why we're doing it. And if the athlete can understand the why behind your cue or behind your exercise, they will take it on. You will see them the next day in their warm-up, and they will be doing it themselves, because they've now seen and realized, okay, that makes sense. So I'm just listening to Alan, I'm thinking it really does come back to, if you can connect the why between your exercise intervention and the movement pattern needed for the sport, I definitely think you get more buy-in, and you can then explore that a lot further. if you don't make them connect the why, if you don't make them understand the mechanism behind it, and not understand it cognitively, but feeling wise, then yeah, you kind of lost your crowd. So that was the first thing I wanted to say there. And then what else have I got on my list? Again, just this recognition that the foot is the only thing that makes contact with the ground generally. So we're producing all these big forces through the hip and disassociating it through our pelvis, and one's flexing, one's extending, and recognition that if you throw a massive punch and you've got a weak wrist, that you probably hurt yourself more than you do your aggressor, the person you're fighting. And the same thing was with the floor. And actually, when we look at running cycle, we look at running pattern, we look at overstriding and long ground contact times, and the shin rolling and the knee rolling, and I must come back to shin roll in a minute, by the way. When we see all of those things, we sometimes are coaching the switching mechanism, the leg exchange mechanism, but we've got to recognize that maybe actually for this athlete right now, an overstriding profile is more efficient for them because they can't create the ankle stiffness. They're going to collapse even more if they're not given the time. So we're looking at what we would say is an inefficient running pattern, and actually the limiting factor to it, we could say, is switching, is limb exchange, but actually when they do switch, they put the foot down, it's soft. So the limiting factor is probably ankle strength, ankle RFD, ankle stability, something around the qualities of the foot and ankle. And that just seems to be the most common thing I see in team sport players. They only really condition their foot and ankle at a performance level when they're injured, when they're doing an ACL, when they're rehabbing an ACL. And I've seen probably over a dozen ankle and Achilles rehabbers who come back and have better stiffness qualities in their injured leg because they've been forced to work on it. And they start to come up with some new hamstring type issues on their uninjured leg, which you would attribute maybe to that being the dominant leg, it's doing all the work, and maybe as a result, that's the injured leg. No, often it's because the previously injured leg has this ability to be stiff, to react. Maybe their time away from normal training has given them maybe another speed impulse, and now the limiting factor is their uninjured leg. The fact that it can't create the RFD just like the previously injured leg can now. And so, there is this link between ankle function, stiffness, and hamstring function. And if you can put your foot in the right place and be really stiff, the timing of your posterior chain is really sweet. It's really nice. If you can't, then actually you're just going to be asking questions.
You were going to mention ankle roll, shin roll,
yeah.
sorry.
I want to be clear here because people will think that I'm saying shin roll is bad, right? And there is I know Chris Corfis and Joel and quite a lot of people are really pushing shin roll as a positive thing. And what I want to be clear here is in very good acceleration, especially early acceleration, we're talking about here. We're talking about team sports. We're talking about how you go from 0 to nothing, or how you go from walking and jogging to sprinting. System roll is really what we're looking for, not just shin roll. And by all means, in a game like maybe basketball, where you are really stop-start and you're going backwards, then going forwards, sometimes the simplest and easiest way is just to roll your shin. But you look at the great players who don't just feint, but they feint and go and accelerate off that step, and their system rolls forwards. And I think that's really important for us to recognize that just talking about shin roll and saying, look, his shin rolls forwards, so that's a good thing. That's not, I don't think that's all we're looking at. Because if we're just talking about shin roll, we're just talking about the knee being dominant. I think when you see the shoulders and shin go together, then actually you end up, and the shoulders, hip and shin go together, you end up seeing a bigger acceleration of the center of mass outside of their body. And as a result, a faster run. So I just want to be clear here. Those guys are talking about good things. I think the rest of the community are kind of saying, so all we want is shin roll. It's like, no, that's just a piece of the puzzle. And it brings me to this thought that Adam Virgil had a really nice tweet that was like, it's not black and white, and he's got nice infographics. Not black and white. It's really 50 Shades of Grey. Yeah, and I think we love. I love the app binary, right? So, but we love to be binary in our brains, but we don't really need to. I think it's recognizing that let's take some of the clues from some of these guys, but actually we do need to piece a picture together for ourselves.
For anyone that hasn't heard anyone or you specifically talk about Shin roll, very briefly,
Oh, okay.
why such a big talking point, and why should people do more digging to find out more about it?
Yeah, okay, fine. When we think on Shin roll, or when we think on acceleration, Alan's talked about big forces in short amount of times in the right direction. Yeah, that phrase has come from us looking at sport, looking at performance, and looking at great performance. So if we want to go forwards in acceleration and we're standing up in our initial position, what we need to be able to do is direct our forces forwards, right? You look to JB and Samazino's work around RF, ratio of force. How much of the force you can create is actually being directed forwards. The Shin, and I take this from Alan, the Shin is our compass. So when Alan talks about pinning your shin, if when you punch your knee forwards and you punch your foot back into the ground, if your shin is pointing in the direction that you want to go, then all you have to do is extend your hip, right? But if you actually land with your shin pointing up, so you've punched the knee forwards, but maybe you haven't punched it back. Maybe you've let it passively drop to the floor. You've let your foot passively drop to the floor. Your shin is now pointing up, but you want to go forwards. You've got a few choices. You could roll until your shin comes into the angle you want and then push. You could push straight away. If you push straight away, you end up pushing up. So if you end up pushing up, but you still want to go forwards, most people will just bend at the waist. And then all they're doing is just wasting a lot of energy. And so what we suggest is if you attack the ground down and back, your bum can push your body forwards and up early. And if you only attack the ground down, you will predominantly be pushing up. And you'll have to compensate around your body postures in order to orientate yourself forwards. So when we're looking at, this really comes down to maybe video analysis. With a lot of the team sports right now, they've recognized, speed vaccine's been around for a while, they've recognized the need to sprint 4 to 6 times a week, reach above 90% of your max velocity or thereabouts, and that will prevent speed-related injuries. And then maybe you just use your sport to get the relevant intensities done during the action, because of perception action and all the tactical stuff that you want to include, right? But what we're also now seeing, and Bristol Bears are a great example of this. I talked to Kevin yesterday and he said I can talk about it here. They're a great example of a team that are using their speed exposures, recording everything on video, reflecting with myself and reflecting using, looking at the kinematics and the kinetics behind what they're doing, and planning their S&C interventions around it. And planning their, or better yet, that's one snapshot. And then watching the game, watching how Pat Lam wants to play, listening to his feedback of what players can and cannot do, and then reverse engineering that into their speed training and reverse engineering that into the gym. But first starting with the movement, first starting with what are they doing on the field, what are they doing when they're running, and actually do we have a snapshot of what we want them to look like? Not a generic model, but what we've done is we've built a model based on normative data. So for the forwards, the backs, for the faster group, the slower group, for the step length dominant, for the step frequency dominant guys, and actually starting to create a clearer picture about what it really means to run fast, to be efficient, and essentially be economic. And so what is shin roll? What shin roll does, as well as a few other key components, but shin roll is one of the easiest ones to see. What shin roll does is let us know, has the ground been attacked, and has there been pre-tension in the limbs that's enabled the hip to extend aggressively and efficiently, or actually is there quite a lot of amortization happening in the ankle and the knee? And are we really just having to focus more on the second part of the ground contact, making it maybe more concentric than we need to? Or actually, can we make use of some of the elastic properties of the hip and the knee by attacking down and back into the floor? So shin roll for me, excessive shin roll for me, just like excessive trunk movement, is actually a sign of inefficiency. Whereas it's becoming popularized as a sign of good acceleration mechanics. So if I watch someone who just rolls their shin and their trunk stays normal or stays upright, I don't see that as a good thing. That looks like we are loading the knee and encouraging a concentric or too much of a concentric propulsive phase of the stance. Versus if I see a shin that stays stable, or I see the shin and the shoulders roll together, stabilize together, and then the hip be near enough the only thing that's moving, that says to me an efficient movement pattern. That says to me hip, knee, and ankle all contributing together, and generally requires and results in a quiet spine. And a quiet spine is just the same thing about is the bum being the major driver of hip extension, or is the lumbar spine and erector spine being the major driver of hip extension? That was a long answer for just shin roll.
No. Great answer. Alan, did you want to mention anything ACL wise specifically on this point?
Popped into my head there while Jonas was speaking, and it was really about, so we talked previously about the foot and the ankle and kind of shin roll and the associated stiffness around the calf and ankle complex. And in ACL rehab, certainly from what I've seen, is that stiffness, that tendon stiffness, that pre-tension, the ability to give yourself a really good platform of that shin roll and that foot and ankle to stay rigid to then allow you to push your hip forward. That tends to be one of the last things to come. But if you start adopting the strategy that we spoke about before, where we start to incorporate ankle, foot, shin, calf complex strengthening work and forces specific, right? Strength is specific. So in modalities that represent what we know we're going to use them for. So in acceleration, in max velocity, in lateral change of direction, shapes and patterns, actually you chop 6 weeks out of what is going to be a 6-week period of trying to regain that stiffness, that ankle, that tendon morphology to thicken and stiffen to give yourself a platform to actually produce force. And to me, that's really what we're talking about, right? And this whole philosophy is that this phase potentiation, this idea that if I know that further down the line I'm going to want to accelerate hard, and that's going to be one of my key performance metrics, that 36 weeks prior to that, I've identified that, and I'm going to do everything I can in my power to break down whatever the qualities are necessary to do that. In this case, ankle stiffness, foot stiffness, and address that early on. Otherwise, when you get to that end point, and you haven't done anything about it yet, all of a sudden you realise, shit, this guy's foot is landing flat. He's got no tension through his calf. He's doing what Jonas said. He's rolling forwards. He's got no stability to use his bum. He's using his quad. He's probably not as fast as he previously was. So now the athlete and the S&C team are getting frustrated. This guy's not back to where he was. He's back, but he's not back. It's that approach to me that is why this is so important. And this example is ankle and foot, but for the whole thing, that's what it's about. It's about understanding that this is my end journey. This is my end destination. Now I've got my roadmap to make it far easier to get there instead of just blindly walking myself through the forest.
I'm gonna jump in there because maybe it's important to justify why this is important. And I think, what is the opposite? What is the opposite to this approach? And generally the opposite to this approach is only focusing on the physical quality around the rehab site and often letting the other qualities detrain, not on purpose, but just by the fact that we're not really stressing the athlete any other way. What are some of the barriers, or why is that important? I think sometimes that happens because people are scared. They don't know what to do. They're limited by what they've been taught, which that's all of our problems. We don't know what we don't know. But also because people can't see. Like, we can all look at someone doing a hop or doing some of the ACL rehab, but we can't all see what efficient movement might look like. And even if we could see it, we don't always trust our eyes. I mean, we've got a good friend, Phil Graham-Smith, and he's been involved in a recent research paper that I think was looking at a hop or triple hop, and was basically, a hop or triple hop is something regularly used in ankle, knee, hip-based rehab to kind of see symmetry between the limbs. And something that all track coaches will probably know, and a lot of other coaches will know anyway, is that just because the hop is equal in distance doesn't mean the contribution of ankle, knee, and hip has been similar. And great compensators, which most of the athletes that we're working with, they're great compensators. They'll find a way to hop further. Last week I was 20% behind my left leg, and this week I know that. So now I'm going to try and be as good as my left leg, and I'm just going to use my knee more. Or when I land, I'm just going to land and take the energy more through my knee and ankle or my hip. And so that I'm going to find a way around not using the injury site. Or I'm going to find a way. Do you know what? There's the same research in ankle stability. It's the same process. That actually a period of time doing some balance exercises around the injury around the ankle showed that a lot of the evolution and a lot of the adaptation has happened in the hip. The ankle couldn't figure it out, so the hip became more stable to support the stability, whereas the ankle was the site that really was the focus site. So I think a lot of the problems in most training comes down to the fact that coaches and practitioners are responsible to see movement and see what efficiency looks like, and the jury is out on what that really is. And so I don't know what to focus on. I'll focus on some numbers. I'll focus on the distance. And again, so coming back to this research is kind of saying, well, not even the distance will give you that clarity. It tells you symmetry, but it doesn't tell you joint contribution. And that's why I love binary. That's why I love video analysis. It doesn't have to be binary. Any video analysis, any way that we can go, let's test our bias. Let's measure an angle. Let's measure a distance. Let's measure a contribution or even a rate of acceleration. And that has become a real big philosophy for me, and has really supported me over the past 10 years of saying, I think this is happening. This is what my eyes say. And then I'll look to Dan Path or Stu or anyone, my wife, who's got great training eyes, and I'll say, this is what I see. And they'll say, this is what I see. And then we'll all be arguing, right? We'll all be standing, I think. And it's like, it's the whole analogy. If we stood on a compass and I saw a W, you might see an M, you might see a 3, you might see an E. Like, we can argue all day. But the best thing about it is video analysis. We're now at a stage where the quality of video we have through our iPhone is similar to lab quality, right? It's very, very trustworthy. We can look at things in super slow motion, and we can now start to measure joint contribution. And I think that is really the next stage going forwards, is by understanding what we want, worst case scenario, or just a performance model. By understanding, maybe thinking laterally and understanding what efficiency should look like, and how an efficient system should generate and dissipate force, we can actually start to measure it. We can measure it at home. I measure my kids all the time. We play around, they do somersaults, they do runs, jumps, and we measure it and say, look, here's the difference. And I think now practitioners are empowered with that information. They can take it into performance, they can take it into rehab, and they can ask themselves, am I actually creating players that are going to be fit for purpose? Or am I just waiting? Am I just doing some leg eccentrics and some Nordic curls? And am I just waiting for them to be able to go back to the technical coach? And I think, again, my last point here is You go to someone like Jordan Mendegucha, who's rehabbed over 500 ACLs, and how many hamstrings has he rehabbed? And your best player at your best team, he's probably rehabbed them at some point. And you look at his process, and he poo-poos Nordics, he poo-poos hamstring eccentrics, he poo-poos fascicle stuff, he poo-poos it. Now, he doesn't say it's not important. He just says that's not the key contributor to preventing injuries. It's a part of the puzzle. But prevention is this whole look of the whole, there's a look at the whole, ecosystem of the athlete, all of the key components they need to move well, and then training that early doors. And the media, you just have to Google him in Spanish or Google him in Portuguese, and you'll see the media love him, but sometimes hate him because he sends back players after 5 or 6 months and they're ready to rock and roll. And the whole medical fraternity said, that's way too fast. There's no way he's ready. You've rushed the process. And really all he's done is he's taken fear out of the system. He's sorted out all the compensations and some of the patterns that would happen in your pelvis or just happen in your leg strike because of the previous injury. And he's made a really robust movement pattern whilst respecting the timeline of injury, of healing, the timeline of healing for the injured site. So people say he's a great physio. I think he's a great performance coach. He just happens to rehab players. And I think that philosophy, that mindset, challenging that mindset or challenging your mindset by getting some video analysis to support you in your process, and also by looking back and going, maybe the way we've done it isn't the best way. It was a way, but maybe there was a better way.
I've got a good example of using that video with a international rugby player, actually. So he's got right to the end stage of his rehab. He was traveling. GPS was saying he's traveling at 10 meters per second. He's real quick. He's faster than he ever has been. He's come back. He's great. And there was a subtle asymmetry going on his injured side, and it was tiny. Like, unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, you're never seeing it. And we put him on binary, and lo and behold, there ends up being a 7 or 8% difference in ground contact time, left versus right. And that tiny little piece of information changed the game in terms of what we did from a training modality point of view. We recognised, his system stiffness, his reactivity off that one injured side isn't quite there, even though drop jumps are telling us it is, because he got good at the skill of doing the test, but the test isn't running. It's not running fast. It's not running as sprinting. So what we did, we put in more coordination, extensive drilling. We actually took it onto a harder surface to allow him to get more feedback going through the limb, and also the training effects that having a slightly harder surface would have. And we started inputting a little bit more of an aggressive plyometric continuum from single leg, particularly at shallower angles of flexion to represent the stance side of the max velocity cycle. And we put in isometrics from the Tara's work. We put in some explosive isometrics on that stance leg. And 2 weeks later, he's upped his speed again, way above and beyond his PB. He's come back, played an extraordinary match. I think he actually got man of the match. And it's those tiny little intricacies that if binary hadn't picked that up, if the video analysis hadn't picked that up, the numbers were he's better than he's been. Job done. Let's throw him back into the 4. But that extra little piece of information meant better became great. And we changed our protocol, and his buy-in to his program increased as a result of it, because he could get visual feedback on some of the numbers and some of the ground contact times and explanations around that. So I think, Jonas, it's just to hammer home the point, the video analysis is so important to not only give the practitioners a little bit of extra information to make good decisions, but it also, the rehab process is about the player. It's about buy-in, it's about engagement and motivation and that psychology of speed. And I think that's exactly what it gave him. It's almost like the glitter on top.
And when you hear Alan talk, you could go, BS, did the man of the match come from the fact that his ground contact times reduced by 500ths or whatever it is. But the reality is, especially injury, can be quite depressing. and you can see some of the biggest characters really lose some of their fire. And even when they return or they're returning, they don't always come back with all of their confidence. They might be starting, they might be playing, but that half a gap that they would normally go through, they don't go through. That, you know, they second guess maybe stepping off of that leg or whatever it is. They give themselves more space when defending a player because they're not really sure if the player goes, if they could go with him. And so those small nuances of confidence can be really addressed if they believe their limiting factor has been addressed. So I know for a fact that changing the kinematics, especially if it's linked to changes in kinetics, so basically not just reducing ground contact time, increasing acceleration, increasing speed is a big deal, and it makes a big deal, either for speed reserve or for actual very specific actions. But let's say it was placebo. Yeah, I'm underselling my brand here. But let's just say it's placebo. Yeah. The effect it has on players, their perception, the effect it has on managers and coaches who today tell you he's played an all right game, but I need this to change. Or players come to you and say, I felt good today, but if I look at the mistakes I made, I really attribute it to my injury or attribute to something. Perception action guys could say, yeah, but he wasn't scanning well. He didn't perceive the environment. Great. But part of that perception action triad is the performer. And if the performer doesn't believe they can do something, they ain't going to do it, or they're going to do it half-assed. And so I always come back to being able to reflect and react with the players. On reflection of a session or on reflection of a certain quality, they say, I believe or I don't believe. And my reaction is to say, right, here is the solution. Now maybe you'll believe. The solution's gone from here to here. The feeling of that quality has gone from here to here. And now my balls are big. Now I feel I'm ready to go. Yeah. And so I definitely see that. And I think we undersell the power of psychology. We recognize what bad psychology does. We don't want the dickheads in the group. We don't want the guys that are bringing down the group. We don't want cliques of people forming in our team that almost go against our culture. But we don't give enough credit to what good energy can create, what good feelings of success in training, and what small wins can do. If you're going 6 months of rehab, you can't just set goals around your Nord board and your Kingcom or something, or your CMJ. You need some goals that feel like training related goals. And again, they can't just be GPS, because that's almost just the what. What volume did you cover? Not the how. You know, not could it be more efficient or more effective? It doesn't empower you with any information as an athlete, or sometimes not even as a practitioner. So there is this psychology of speed thing that I always come back to. I think most of my philosophy has been based around influencing people's perceptions, just as much as it is being about influencing maybe their movement pattern. Again, I digress. I don't really know where I've come from to get there.
Class. No. I think we could absolutely definitely keep going. However, my wife's going to burst in any second with. I know it's flowing on it. It's all good though. It's fine. But one last thing, you guys have got some exciting stuff in this area coming up over the next couple of months. Where can people keep up to date with when that drops?
Yeah,
Jonas, is that for you?
Yeah, I guess. Look, social media is now the best free advertising in the world, isn't it?
Yep.
So, you know, most of it's going to be on social media, where we've had over 500 people sign on to our virtual internship over the past 4 months. And it's been amazing. Every major sport and every league, like, we've had great practitioners on. Some people I look to are now buying into my stuff, so I'm really happy. But it's been long. It's 40 hours of content. You really have to be into it, and it can take 12 weeks to get through. Whereas now what we're doing is we're synthesizing that into a simpler model. We're going to do some micro learning around it, and it's going to be really focused on the S&C coach. So over the summer, we're going to create a bit of content for you guys to buy into and to listen and to learn and to follow. And that's really just there to simplify this whole speed thing, take away speed and make it efficiency, and giving you guys the building blocks to be able to work on that. So we'll be dropping that soon. No doubt you'll be tweeted and you'll be reposting it for us.
Of course. As always.
as always.
No doubt. Thank you very much, guys. Alan, absolute pleasure to finally put a face to a name, and pleasure's all mine.
Tell my missus this morning, I was like, I can't believe I'm going to be on the Pacey Performance Podcast. So there we
The
go.
Pacey Performance
Stop
Podcast.
it. Stop
The
it now.
millions of downloads. Yeah.
And Jonas, it's a pleasure as always. Excited to see what comes out in the next couple of months. Keep doing what you guys do. Keep smashing it.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a good one, guys.
Cheers, guys.
Good morning. Bye-bye.